And so that part was really important. But it's like, I worked cattle for 2 years in Texas, and I did There Will Be Blood. And we had a guy working on that ranch who was like the guy that would watch over us.
Oh, yeah.
And I told him, I said, he said he had to work cattle, and I was talking about moving cattle from one pasture to another. And he said, it's not that easy. I said, listen, I used to do that. And I know it's not that easy, but it's not that hard either, And I said, you get up on a horse and they'll follow you most of the time. And he looked at me and said, how do you know that? And so I told him my history of working cattle in Texas on me and this other guy would just job out to different ranches. And after I told him that story, he said, listen, I'm going to work all my cattle next week. Can I hire you? I said, I don't think you can pay me enough.
I mean, I know people that double dip a lot.
Locations, go to 2.
Todd on 2. Hi, my name is Todd Christensen. I'm a Teamster 399 location manager, founding member of Location Managers Guild International, and this is Locations on 2.
This is Dodd Vickers, your host for Locations on 2, the podcast that takes you around the world and behind the scenes with location managers working on every type of entertainment product being produced today. You can find me online at doddvickers.com. Locations on 2 is brought to you by the Location Managers Guild International. The LMGI is a global organization of location professionals working in the film, television, and commercial industries. Visit them online today at locationmanagers.org. Not only is Todd Christensen a filmmaker working as a producer and location manager, he's also a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Todd has worked and collaborated on such projects as Moneyball, There Will Be Blood, Hunger Games, both Sicario movies, and most recently, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. That said, let's jump on over to the back channel where the real work gets done on set. Locations on 2. I heard somewhere your background before you got into the film industry, you were in fine arts. You had a gallery, is that right?
No, I showed at galleries.
Oh, okay.
I did ceramics. I worked with a master ceramicist in Taos, New Mexico, and then I worked with a painter in New York City because the family, Ken Price's family, they thought he and his wife came to me and they said they thought I might be a painter because I didn't study. Mm-hmm. And so I started teaching myself how to paint. And so I did ceramics for like 8 years, and then I've been painting since 1983.
Okay. So originally you thought you were going to be an artist, is that right?
Yes.
Did you ever go to school to get any formal training, or you were just kind of learning it by doing it?
I did not. I went to school to become a lawyer and a diplomat, which is what I ended up doing in the movies. It's funny how stuff comes around,
What were you?
It really. I mean, seriously.
Yeah. Well, it's a funny way to put it because that is where we spend a lot of our time, isn't it?
Yeah, reading contracts, and then we're the face of production, so it's a diplomatic position.
Absolutely. So, what type of art were you doing primarily? You said painting and ceramics. Did you have one that you kind of ended up doing more of than the other, or did you kind of have?
Yeah, I started painting. I lived in Dallas, Texas, and I moved to New York City. I got a job picking up and delivering art on a truck, and then moved to New York City that way in 1985, and then painted on the weekends and whenever I had a chance. Sure. And kept developing. Did a few shows there. I did that job, and then I jumped over and I managed buildings. First, I got a C of O for a building, and then I managed apartments.
Oh, really? So you were like a property manager for a group or for somebody?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
And I managed 2 construction crews on 300 apartments.
Oh, wow. Well, you were busy.
And some of them were lived in by these Sicilians, which was, was an amazing job. And in Texas, I had been... I worked cattle for 2 years.
Really?
Yeah,
okay,
for room and board. After I'd worked for room and board for this artist for like 14 months. So I spent about a little over 3 years not making any money.
I have to ask you, though, I got to get you to back up for 1 second because you kind of shot right past it. You mentioned the fascinating life of working with these Sicilians. But I want to ask you about
there was a mafia guy. He was a bodyguard that had a bar on the in the middle of the block.
Uh-huh.
And so there's these two women that I got. I mean, there was a lot of Sicilians that lived in that building. They'd been in there since the 40s, 50s. And so Maria was one of them. And Maria would like have me go up to her apartment so she could show me what needed to be fixed. Mm-hmm. I'd go up to Maria's apartment. She'd say, "Sit down. I'm going to feed you." And I said, "Well, I'm not hungry." She said, "Sit down. I'm going to feed you." "Well, just tell me what's wrong up here." And she said, "Sit down. I'll feed you, and then I'll tell you." And then, okay. So then I learned with Maria, like, don't eat before you go up to Maria's. So one day I said to her, I said, "Hey, there's some blood out in front of the club. Did you hear anything last night?" She said, "I don't see, I don't hear, I don't talk. Nothing, Todd. Nothing." Just like,
Omerta.
The Sicilians. Then there was this other one. What was her name? Irene. And she'd been in an apartment. She paid $15 a month. No, $50 a month for two apartments.
Oh, cow.
And she had once owned the building. And she loved two things more than anything. She went to church every day, and she swore like a truck driver. And it was just, I loved her. It was just glorious. I just went out in the street, and people would come and yell at me. and somehow it just calmed me down because I told them the truth. And it was like the cattle and the driving the truck, all these different things ended up being college for locations.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that is one of the interesting things I discover is that a lot of the best location managers I know started off doing something completely different and adapted the skills they learned doing that into working in locations. How did you get into locations?
Well, I knew Dennis Hopper back in the early 70s.
Oh, really? And
when I knew Dennis, because I lived up in Taos, New Mexico.
Okay.
And I knew Dennis, and my so we'd go over to Dennis's and do all kinds of things, but we go over to Dennis's. So I thought, like, wow, because I took a film class in college and went to the University of New Mexico, and I thought, well, I guess I'm going to get into the movies because of Dennis. And it was too crazy a time. Dennis had been blackballed at that time. This was 1971. So it never came up, And when I started making art, I knew a lot of artists and a lot of actors and different people in the movie business, but I never really thought about doing it. So when I moved to L.A., from New York to L.A. in 1991, I started doing scenic painting with some guys.
Oh, with your art background, that makes sense.
I did that. I ran into a guy I had met briefly in New York, and he said, I want to come over and look at your paintings. So I said, great. I was like, I really needed to sell a painting.
Right.
So, and I knew he had money, he had a nice car. So I had him, he came over to my place and he looked at stuff and he was looking around. Then he looked at me and he said, I can't find anybody I trust and I really need some help. And I said, well, what do you need? He said, well, I got to find somebody to help me with these jobs I'm doing. I said, well, what's the job? He said, well, I'm a location manager and I'm working on this TV show and I need help. And, you're like a creative guy and you're good around people. And do you have a camera? And I said, yeah, got a camera. He said, great. Well, I'll call you up. So he called me about a month later and he said, do you want to, I said, I need some help. I need some day playing for the next month. And I said, well, let me think about it. Cause I thought like, is this going to take me away from my painting? Right. And I called my girlfriend and then I realized I had $250 to my name. That was my savings account. And I said, and she said, do whatever you want, and I called him up and I said, tell me where you want me. And so that's how I started. And I went in, I did it, and I did a pilot with him.
Really? Who was this?
His name was Mitchell Binder. And right now he's got a jewelry company called King Baby.
Okay.
He was never and he's got his jewelry all over the world in big places, in Vegas, in China, and Paris. He never liked being a location manager. So in some way, like I got really fortunate. Like he didn't like doing location managing really. And so he had me do everything. I worked out the budget with him. I scouted, I prepped, I wrapped, I negotiated contracts, all that right at the get-go.
So you jumped in as essentially as like an assistant manager.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. And then then I met a guy, Ralph Coleman, through Mitchell, and he said Ralph does movies. And I thought at one point, if I'm going to do this, I want to do movies. So I met Ralph, and about 3 weeks after I met Ralph, he called me up. I was scouting Japanese music videos.
Okay.
And I had enough days to join the union at that point. I had like 35, 40, I had 42 days.
Okay.
But I didn't have enough money. And so Ralph called me up and he said, "Hey, I've got a movie and I want you to help me." And I said, "Great. When can I start?" He said, "You're going to start in a week." He said, "I'm going to get a script over to you and then I want you to read it so you know what the deal is." I said, "So what's the movie?" He said, it's called Old Friends. And it's with Jack Nicholson, which eventually became As Good as It Gets.
Oh, with Helen Hunt.
Yes.
Okay.
So that was my first movie. And then, a month after I joined that movie, I got into the union. And it was funny because I'd run into different location managers because I was already going to all the union meetings because they said, even before I was in the union, which was forbidden. You weren't supposed to do it for both. You weren't supposed to do that, but I didn't know.
Yeah.
So I just went there and I introduced myself to people, and I was like, when I started doing this, I was 45.
Uh-huh.
So I was a little older. I had a lot of experience doing a lot of jobs, and I was like a worker. I showed up early, I left late. And so I did that movie. I loved it. So I said, okay, I want to be good. I want to get good at this, and so I bopped around between some other location managers, doing some day playing, sometimes getting on a show. I did Mouse Hunt and what else? I did a movie up in Utah where basically I was the second unit location manager, but I was an assistant. But I did all the stuff. I set up the whole thing. I had one assistant. And when I did As Good as It Gets in LA, it was just Ralph Coleman and me.
That was the whole department. Wow.
Yeah, that was it.
So all these early jobs you were doing, from Japanese music videos to other things, did you really have a good understanding of the job of the location manager? Yeah. Do you feel like they really prepared you properly for what the job is?
In many ways they did. And Ralph was like a great teacher. Mm-hmm. And he told me how to do a neighborhood and a block and how to handle all those things. And so but the first job, because he didn't want to do things, I did everything, so I knew the basics.
Right.
But I want to tell you the story, and this is like on that pilot that I did with Mitchell. I'm standing on the street. This is what I knew about filming. I'm standing on the street, and a Teamster comes by, and I says, "Hey, I need some help. Do you know where the honey wagon is?" And he looked at me and he said, "Behind you." That's how I started. That's what I do. Like, that's how I started. Like, if you work really hard, anybody can do this. And like, you learn on the fly, there's so many things you learn on the fly.
Yeah.
It's a problem solving job. So, I was good at problem solving because I lived poor for a long time, sort of hand to mouth living, making art, working odd jobs. So, I had these skills that I brought to the job.
And it's funny because so many of us are jacks of all trades and we incorporate these things into the job we do now. Of all the jobs you did before you got into the business, do you have one that you think really prepared you the best for what you do as a location manager?
A couple of things. Like, I'll give you a few examples. Like, working with artists, because what I brought to the job was creativity. That's the one thing I'd always been working on. I'd always looked at everything, looked closely. So the whole thing about scouting and finding places came really natural. And so that part was really important. But it's like, I worked cattle for 2 years in Texas, and I did There Will Be Blood. And we had a guy working on that ranch who was like the guy that would watch over us. And I told him, I said, he said he had to work cattle, and I was talking about moving cattle from one pasture to another. And he said, it's not that easy. I said, listen, I used to do that. And I know it's not that easy, but it's not that hard either, And I said, you get up on a horse and they like to, they'll follow you most of the time. And he looked at me and said, how do you know that? And so I told him my history of working cattle in Texas me and this other guy would just job out to different ranches. And after I told him that story, he said, listen, I'm going to work all my cattle next week. Can I hire you? I said, I don't think you can pay me enough.
I mean, I know people that double dip a lot when they're working, but that's a little bit out of the norm. I don't think I've anybody asked to do this. Totally different job.
I got his respect, Sure. I went into a place and they were worried about taking their paintings down. And I said, well, I'll do it for you if you want. Cause I hung paintings and took paintings down for years. I said, paintings worth $100,000. When I did that job, I would hang paintings for people. And they said, after I told them that story, they went like, oh, okay. Because they were trying to find a way to say no. And I just said, listen, if you don't want to do it, don't do it. I'm not here trying to convince you and then you be upset while we're here. I don't want you upset. I want you to be on the same page with us.
I think that's something I say to people too. And I think they're surprised by that because we definitely love their house, their business, whatever it is. And we want them to say yes. But when I'm talking to them, I say, you can always say no. I don't want you to feel like we're forcing you to do this. I want you to say yes because you want to do it. And I want you to ask me the hard questions so you feel like it's going to be a good experience. So you know what to expect.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, catches them off guard because they're expecting the hard sell.
Yeah.
They've heard a horror story from some friend they know that had some filming or something.
And then, the other thing is explaining contracts to them. And, a lot of the fights that I had with contracts were with my lawyers, not with their lawyers or with them, because it's that fine line that we walk because we have to honor the location. That's how we make our living and get production as much as we can. And, I've been pretty much 100% successful. And the other thing that I learned early on that I saw that was important is that I can, in 24 years of doing this, I can go back to every location I've ever filmed at.
No,
and they'd be happy to see me, because I made fair deals and I took care of them. If something broke, if something happened, we painted the walls, we redid the floors, whatever it was,
Right.
I got it done, and that's the kind of reputation that I wanted to keep. And then I'd always tell producers at the beginning of a show, this is who I am. And if we need to do something at a place to fix something, then we need to do that. And they're like, okay, I'm on board. I like that.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to make every effort to avoid it. And if there's precautions we can take, we're going to do that. But things still will happen. Yeah. And I want people to know that I'm not disappearing the minute the show stops rolling camera.
Yeah.
That we're going to make you happy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
I think there's a comic people like to point out of the Trojan horse being drug up to a house, and it's the location manager in front and the film crew hiding inside. And it's funny, but at the same time, I hate that perception that you're going to be surprised. I don't want people to be surprised.
Yeah, well, they would say I've heard all these stories and that I wouldn't want a film crew coming to my place. They said, would you want a film crew coming to your place? I said, as long as I'm the location manager.
Right, exactly.
Because I take care of it. I know how to take care of a place. I mean, I know how to, if something's broke, fix it. I know how to have the crew respect the place. Mm-hmm. Whatever might happen, that I have the respect of the crew to respect the locations. Because I've had these conversations. It's like, I had one with the Teamsters once, the drivers, early on when I was an assistant. Mm-hmm. And this guy kept pulling into this parking spot. And I said, you can't park there. And because I made a deal with these architects right here, nobody can park in those 3 spots. And he'd give me the finger. He would, he did this 3 days in a row. And I had told the captain, nothing happened. He kept doing it. So I went over to the Teamsters, to the coordinator, and I told him what was going on. He said, I'll take care of it. I said, really? Really? I said, you know what? I'm going to get a knife and slit your tires. It just came out of my mouth. You know what I mean? And I was like, what have I done? And he looked at me and he said, you'll what? I said, that guy is slitting my tires.
Yeah, euphemistically, yeah.
And the coordinator looked at me and he said, he will never bother you again. And that guy for the rest of the show wouldn't even look at me. And it's because, like, hey, do you want me to knock over your camera? You know what I mean? Do you want me to pull your cables? Like, we respect each other. We find these common languages to, like, gain. Those Teamsters, man, after that, love me.
Yeah.
Because they saw that all I wanted was respect. I wanted to honor a deal.
Right.
And they got that.
Yeah, I think that's, I joke that I think half the crew really doesn't understand what we do.
Right.
You go even further than not knowing about scouting and the creative role we play before they ever show up to work. But even during work, I think they think we just create a place for them to park and for everybody else to go put the camera in, and for the actors to do their thing. But I really don't think they understand the logistics and the big picture of all of the things that we that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis during production.
They don't want to know, because if they did know, then they wouldn't do some of the things they do. You know what I mean? It's almost, and I have educated a lot of people along the lines, about like what we do and why I need. This is how I make my living. So please respect. If something happens, just tell me. And I'll take care of it. Stuff happens, like you said. But the other part is like that I have the support of the producers to take care of a place. Like when I did the Ballad of Buster Scruggs with the Coen brothers, Joel and Ethan were also producers.
Yes.
And when I'd go to certain locations, there was this one pristine valley in Colorado for All Gold Canyon, and this guy doesn't let anybody even come on there to fish. And I was able to bring 100 people in and go all over the place. And I did all kinds of things to protect the property and be able to do what we did. And they just said, like, Todd, whatever it takes, you take care of this guy. When you leave here, you make sure that he's happy. Mm-hmm. And then that was in August. And then I called that guy in the spring. And I said, tell me what your property looks like. And he said, looks like nobody was ever here.
Oh, that's great.
And I said, that's it. But I follow up on certain people. And then, you make friends. I just hiked up in Telluride and went to this guy's property because I wanted to take Pamela and a couple of friends to this waterfall that was there. And I saw him, and he was, like, happy to see me.
Yeah.
I mean, Dodd, that's one way that I moved up in the business, but it's also the one way that I kept my self-respect all the way through, that I honored certain things. And when the producers saw that, they saw, and I would tell them, like, I can go back to any location I've ever filmed at. I'd like to keep that going. Yeah.
No, I've had that same goal, and I stress that to my team. I said, I never, long after the crew leaves, we're still going to be here, and not only will we may want to film that location again, but I want to make sure if I see those people at dinner, they're happy to see me. Yeah, and that's very likely because we live here where half the crew doesn't.
Right.
And I had a call one day from another locations team that was trying to utilize a church, and they said, "What did you do at this church?" And I was really nervous. I was like, "Oh my God, what did we do at this church?" They said, "No, we wanted to use it just as a base camp and catering space, and they asked if you were working on the show." And when I said no, they said, "No, we're not interested." And they said, if Dodd's doing it, then we know it's going to be done right. But the other shows we've had haven't done it. So I actually called and vouched for these people because it was one of my mentors. And I knew that she had taught me how to do it, would be treating them properly. And they let her film, and she was happy and they were happy. But that's the reputation I always want to have. I never want anybody to dread seeing me coming up their driveway.
Oh, yeah, man. Yeah. Or for the word to get around. I mean, the word that got around with me, is that if Todd's doing it, it's going to be good, or they would say, like, okay, now we know how it should go.
Right.
And, it's like when I went to North Carolina to do the Hunger Games, and I had the National Forest guy here in Santa Fe and a woman who is a park ranger down in White Sands wrote letters for me. Mm-hmm. And that I had with me, and I showed them to the National Forest that I filmed at in North Carolina outside of Asheville, and they went, "Wow, good, okay, where do you want to go?" It's like,
I think communication is one of the maybe not. I don't think people pay enough attention to being completely communicative about what you're trying to do, being fully transparent, and about communicating it both ways.
Yeah.
Not only to the place where we're trying to film, but making sure the production understands the concerns that the location has. Not just, did you get the contract? Yeah, I've got a contract, but here are the expectations. So that the production's not surprised when you come in and say, okay, following up on what we discussed before we went on, we have to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. Like on Sicario, we filmed at we filmed at Laguna Pueblo, and the pueblos I filmed at in New Mexico, and a number of them. And Laguna I'd never filmed at, but the director and producers had taken them to see the village. And basically you can't film in villages. It's sort of across the line, across the spectrum, that just isn't allowed, for a lot of different reasons. And also the thing at the pueblos, if somebody dies, they shut it down. So if you're in a village, then you're susceptible, so I went there. I took the directors, Denny Villeneuve and Roger Deakins, and I took them all through and went there a couple of times. And I kept telling this guy Vernon, who was the guy who took me around, I'm nervous, man. I got to tell you, I just, I need to talk to the governor or the council. Put me in front of the council, whatever it is, so that I know that I can bring them here, because they're like married to this. Yeah, and I need to tell them now, yes or no. And he said, okay. So we started to go into the administrative building, and a guy comes out of the administrative building, and Vernon says, hey, Todd, you got to meet Harry. Harry's the mayor domo of the village. So, Harry, this is Todd. Then he told Harry what I was doing, who I was, and what I was doing there. And then Harry looked at me and he said, Todd, you look like economic development to me. And I knew I was in, man. I knew I was in. I still said I need to talk to the lawyer. So we go in and we talk to the lawyer. And I said, listen, I know that there's protocols, there's all kinds of things you need to do, especially if you're filming in the village. So, let me talk to the governor. I'm happy to go talk to the governor or the council, whatever. She said, you've already been approved. And partly it was the kind that I have a son from a pueblo, from Taos Pueblo, so I know the culture, I know the respect that you give, I know the protocols, I know the questions to ask. It's like I said right off, like, what if somebody dies? Are you going to shut us down? They said, no, we'll just make sure you're not in the burial area. And somebody died. And so we switched some of our stuff around, and then we gave them our catering area. We moved our catering area to another place, and we stayed away. Everybody respected it. They took care of their thing, and we continued to film, and it all worked out. And the reason it worked out is because I asked the question, so it's one of those things, Todd, that we learn, right? Like, what are the questions I need to ask? Yeah. At any place, like in pueblos and that, it's a little extraordinary, or tribes. Yeah. There's a lot of places like Zia Pueblo, you're never close to the village, so you don't have to worry about somebody dying because you're off in these other areas. They have 150,000 acres. Laguna has 660,000 acres. And I filmed it at some of that acreage also, around there. And they loved it, man. They loved it. I hired a bunch of people. I spread the money. But not I was fair. Yeah. But I wasn't like, throwing $100 bills around. I was just being fair with everybody, and they loved it. They loved being part of it. They loved watching it. It's that whole thing that we do that I love doing, is like to bring people close, to bring them close to the camera. Yeah. So that they can watch what's going on, so that they have that story to tell, because we're coming to their property, their neighborhood, or their whatever it might be, their school, and they're allowing us to be there. They get paid some money, but they're allowing us to be there, and to get to show to see their excitement about seeing something like that, man, is just gold.
Yeah, I have to remind people, and I have kind of a running joke, and I'm tempted to do it one day. I keep saying that I need to change my business cards to just say professional guest.
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
Because that's what we are. And we need to
that's
behave
what I
that
say
way.
Too. That's why when I have the production meetings where we go on the tech scout, I said, like, everybody, we're guests. Like, I'd always, early on, the people would come to me and say, like, we own this, right? I said, no, we're guests. Yes. Now, I have all these things that you can do. Is there anything else that you haven't told me that you want to do? Because I have a relationship with these people, so I can ask them the question. Because I have a relationship. And most of the time when I have that relationship and they say, hey, Todd, in that house, I know they said no upstairs. Can we go upstairs and put a camera looking down? And I'll go to them and I ask them the question. They'll go like, yeah, if there's just a few people, that's fine. Right. Or they'll say, yeah, for $500. Okay, I'll write you another check. So, that whole thing of developing relationships. My father was a salesman. I used to go with him. I used to see him get people laugh, and he would tell them stories. And, by the time I leave most locations, they know who I am, where I grew up, how many sons I have 2 sons, where I live now. They know me. I know them. I know about where their kids are going to college, or, there's things that just happen in the course of making the deal that makes people feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think sometimes the show gets so hectic that people forget how important that relationship building is to being successful at what we do. And that if they had taken that extra few minutes, that they would have prevented a problem instead of having to solve that problem later.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing, I always wanted to teach a class called Meditation and Location Management.
I want to take that class.
Yeah, right. Because I was one of the early jobs. It's like something happened and I had to make some phone calls, and everybody was freaked out. But I can't even remember what it was, of course. But the producer came up to me and he said, like, you're not even upset. You should be upset. And so I held the phone and I said, like, listen, I can be upset and it'll take me another hour, but right now I'm talking to somebody to take care of the problem. And the whole thing I learned is, like, don't buy into the fear.
That's right.
And be as calm as you can in dealing with something, because it is actually the quickest way to get to a solution.
Yeah, I've had people when you have that oh shit moment, and all of a sudden something is just, it feels like a disaster, but you've got to fix it. And people are like, you haven't stopped smiling. And I'm like, well, what is the point of that? It doesn't help me solve the problem we're having right now. Now, I just have to solve the problem.
Right. Yeah. And
I can sit here and stomp and scream all day. It doesn't fix it. Yeah.
And then, like, losing locations, like I lost a location on Sicilian in Baltimore. Everybody had approved it, but it finally went to the guy, a single owner of the bank. And he said no. I got the governor involved. I got the mayor involved. And they sent him notes and he wouldn't say yes. So I already had a scout out looking. And then, I had told the producers what was going on. And then when, it's like I had some files and I said to the producer, I said, has anybody told Stephen? And she said, no, you're telling Stephen. And I was like, okay. So we go out and we're filming in a hangar, and I wait till he's done. And then he comes out and I go to him and I said, hey, Steve. And the producers are all standing in a row, in the back, because he's like been a little surly with people. Mm-hmm. And so they're standing there, and I said, hey, I got good news and bad news. And he said, well, before you give me any news, that one assistant you have, do you think I can get her phone number? And he and I had a mutual friend who was like a famous writer. And then we started laughing, and then so I told him the bad news. We lost that location. I said, the good news is I have some file folders here, and I'll show you. He said, Todd, you always knock it out of the park, man. You're great. This is fine. Then we're laughing. We're telling some stories. And I walk over to the producers. They said, what happened? And I said, he loves the new location.
And this is one he had not even seen prior to you showing.
No.
Well, that's where the trust relationship we were talking about comes into play, when you build that relationship. Yeah. Had you worked with Stephen Gaghan before?
No, I hadn't.
Oh, okay.
I hadn't. We both knew this guy, Cubby Selby, and who wrote Last Exit to Brooklyn.
Oh, the novel, yeah.
Which is famous. And I knew Cubby for quite a while. And just that connection right there just like tied us, Mm-hmm. And then it was just maintain and be straightforward and honest.
Yeah, always. You teach classes a lot, teaching people about location management. And one of the classes you teach, you bring the students in as if they've been hired as the location manager. And they're handed a script, which they have to then start doing some research on, doing a breakdown. When you're teaching location management, what aspect of the job do you think it's hardest to teach somebody?
I think that the understanding of how to shoot a location and how to find one is like really important, but it usually is something that I talk about as we go along. The big part is juggling. Mm-hmm. Like I got 30 locations. And I have 30 contracts, and I have the contracts for catering, and to put all these things in place, and then to talk to them about how to successfully proceed with accomplishing all those different things, and keeping your head on your shoulders. I got my son has done. My youngest son has done, he did like 8 movies with me.
Oh, I didn't know that. As an assistant? Is that what he was? Okay.
As an assistant. First, There Will Be Blood. I flew him into Texas to be my assistant there because I said, like, what are you doing this summer? He broke his collarbone. He's a major snowboarder. And I said, what are you doing this summer? He said, I'm driving a van back and forth for tubing down a river in Montana. And I said, how much you making? He said, $50 a day. I said, I'll triple it. He said, well, when do you need me? And when he was a little kid, I took him to sets. Like I took him to one set on Inspector Gadget at 4:00 in the morning, and I left at 9:00.
That sounds familiar.
And, he met Matthew Broderick, and who was a big hero of his. And Matthew was great. We set it up to surprise him. And we were going home, and he looked at me and he said, now I know why you're so tired.
Yeah.
And then I said, would you ever think about doing this? He said, are you kidding me?
Right.
And work those hours? And, now he did, Buster Scruggs with me, and Only the Brave, Sicario. He's done a bunch of shows with me, and he shows up early and he leaves late. And he's a hard worker, and he's smart. And he gets upset when people aren't doing it the right way. That's how I taught him.
I was talking to somebody the other day, and we were saying that, it's probably one of the most flattering things a crew member can say to me is, I couldn't do your job.
Yeah.
And I look at him and say, you're probably right. You couldn't.
Right.
It definitely takes.
Isn't it funny that it is the fact that I kind of fell into it, and then it ended up being something that fit me like a glove. There's a couple of shots I had at producing, and I produced a little movie for Campbell Scott, but I also did the locations, and I took garbage out, and I got the catering. I did everything. It was a little low budget movie, and I said if I do, I'd work with Campbell anytime, but I really like being a location manager. I don't know if I want to do any of these other things,
right.
that like people move up to UPM and to things. And I think that's great. But man, I really love being on the ground. I love meeting people, talking to them, having that relationship, being the diplomat for the production company.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And talking in front of city councils and county, talking to sheriffs and, I love that stuff.
Yeah, me too.
I was like wild in my 20s, and I was on As Good as It Gets, and they had moved. I met the guy who helped us close the road on 4th Street, downtown LA, and I was walking towards those, and the company was out into the first lane where they weren't supposed to be. And a cop was there, and I started yelling at him. And I got close to the AD, and I said, I need to yell at you because this is the guy. He'll shut us down. Yeah. So just like, I need to yell at you right now. Just be okay with that. And he said, I'm fine, And so, and then it ended up being okay. They moved it out right away. So I'm standing at the barricade the next day with the cop. And he looked at me, he said, you liked yelling at me, didn't you? And I said, I got to tell you, I did enjoy it. And he and I were friends. I did a lot of work with him, It's like...
I was wondering if there's a specific project when you think about all the things you've done, not because of the profile of the project or the director you were working with or the actors that were in it or anything like that, but just because you felt like you were in the groove from beginning to end. Is there a specific project you look back on and say, man, that was perfect. I couldn't have done any better.
Yeah. The Sicario,
okay.
Moneyball was one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great picture.
And Sicario, just in the groove. And Denis Villeneuve, the director, was and Roger.
They're a great team.
Roger. So the producers at the start, I did the Valley of Elah with Roger, and so the producers had me come in the office, and they said, "So you worked with Roger before? How'd that go?" I said, "It went great." They said, "Well, tell me about that. How did it go?" "Great." I said, "I just gave him everything he wanted." He said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "You know what? That's what I'm going to do on this show too." I loved
Right.
Roger because Roger made what I always thought. I've worked with a lot of really high-end people.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like, there was no ego with Roger. Roger made all creative decisions. His decisions were based on the creativity and what was best for the show. I never saw anything different than that. He's my favorite of all times, and then the other movie was recently the Ballad of Buster Scruggs with.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. That was a fun project.
With the Coen brothers,
Yeah.
and that was like on my bucket list, man.
I bet.
And I had done 3 movies in a row, 2 at once. That the producers were the same producers for both movies, and they wanted me to put the crews together and work on both shows. And I had done Only the Brave was also one that went so smooth, and it was like the hardest movie probably I've ever done, a fire movie about 19 guys that die, And so Bob Graff called me, the producer, when I'm just finishing up. I'm like a week out from finishing these 3 shows in a row. And he said, "Hey, Todd, the Coen brothers want you to do their next picture." And I said, "Do you know how tired I am right now?" And I'd done a movie called Paul with Bob and just loved him and Karen, UPM. And I said, "Listen, man, I'll work it out." I said, "I'm going to South Dakota to see my family. I was going to fly there, but I will drive there. And on the drive back, I'll scout Nebraska. And in the meantime, I'll hire a couple of scouts to go out so I can get a month," because Pamela and I went to Oaxaca for a week. And, that I took some time, and they went, "Great. That's great." And just like everything I imagined or didn't about working with those guys was all met. They were like really great guys. They were really smart, interesting, not that talkative, but at times they were, but they were very clear about what they wanted, and they were very respectful of every location we went to. I mean, they come to me, "Todd, is there anything we need to do? Can I help?" You just don't get that all the time. They're all like
absolutely not
in the show, and they were just like, I told them, I said, "I'm going to probably retire soon, but if you guys call me, I'll show up."
Well, we haven't talked to anybody that's worked with the Coen brothers. I've actually worked with Denis and with Roger together on Prisoners.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a great movie, man. And John Stark.
Yes, that's right.
Like he and I are fast friends to this day.
Yeah, no, I was an assistant manager at the time. I was an assistant manager at the time, but I learned a lot and had a great experience, and definitely one of my favorites today. But I haven't talked to anybody that's worked with the Coen brothers. So just as far as giving us a little bit of a perspective, when you have that, as we talked about in so many of our podcasts, we have that creative role we play from the beginning of the show until the cameras show up and we go to work. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the process that they go through with their location manager, production designer, when they're coming up with the feel for their films. What kind of direction do you get with them, and how do they approach communicating what they're hoping to get from you?
Well, most of the communication about what to get was through the production designer, Jess Goncher, who I had done Moneyball with, and who's just like, I love the guy, and so a lot of it was through them. But they would get to a place and make decisions like we did some of the western towns here, but I had a scout go out to eastern Colorado up to Nebraska. I had already scouted Nebraska. I knew where we were going to shoot, and we found a ranch in Scotts Bluff that we were going to film at. So I get up there and I take them to the ranch, and I meet the guy from the ranch, and it's a 30,000 acre ranch. And so we go up to the top of the hill. We follow this guy. We go to the top of the hill. They get out of the car, and they look out, and Joel looks at me and he said, "All right, this is it." I had another place in the Sandhills lined up as well. I had backup.
Oh, I'm sure.
And he said, like, "This is it now." I said, well, we got about 4 hours of driving to do. This is a 30,000 acre ranch. But I have to say, we need to, these are tough roads, and we need to like try to get it close. So we go and they're like picking places. I said, it's going to take too much time to get here and to get back. And they picked what they liked, but they were so funny together, man. They would stand in a place and then Joel would go, uh-huh. And then Ethan would go, and then Joel would go, yeah. And then Ethan would take off and start walking. And then I would look, it's like, okay, I got to follow Ethan. So I follow Ethan. And he walks out for a while, and then he shakes his head and he turns around, he comes back, and Joe goes, anything? He says, nah. Okay, serious. So, but they found these places that were difficult. So I slowly would make this point, like, listen, I'll find this one like this where the Indians come down to come, against this guy and this gal. They come down the hill. I said, I'm going to find a place closer to the road, man, because we need to fill these days up.
Right.
And I found a place that was great. Anytime I would say, like, do you think we should move a little closer? I'll find something. And they would come up a little closer and they'd say, like, yeah, we can do this angle. We can do this angle. We can get, like, they would be real creative about how they could shoot a place. But there was one place that was really difficult and they wouldn't let go of it. And I was happy that they, you know what I mean? It's like sometimes you just got to go to that place, whatever it takes.
Right.
You go there. So they got that shot at the end of the day. We had places called Dead Cow and, all these other spots that we would do. And they also, in that movie, told me it's the hardest movie they've ever done.
Really?
Yep. And it was...
Why? Did they say why that was the hardest?
Well, they never explained it to me, but this is with the talk with the producers because there were 6 stories that had to, they couldn't be missed. The first story had to be done completely before you went to the second story. Had to be done completely before you went to the third story. And all new actors, all new locations, all new looks. And they were difficult. When we went up to Nebraska and Scotts Bluff, they had 15 wagons. And how do you do the second take?
Oh yeah.
When they're coming down, they're listening to somebody and they got that all figured out with special effects and transpo. They unhooked the animals. They put a 4-wheeler on it. They turned them around and it got to be really efficient. But at the start, I asked Bob, I said, so how long are the days? He said 10 hours. I said, great. We never had anything less than 12-hour days. Of course. But they had done 10-hour days. I mean, Bob had done, I don't know, 10, 12 movies with them.
Yeah.
And they were always 10-hour days, but not this one. And I was so happy just to be on it. Sure. And everything went really smooth. At the end of the movie, they both said, like, best team ever, best team ever. And they both said, we want to work with you again. And that's the compliment. One of the other great compliments from directors, like on Only the Brave, which was really difficult, was that he never said anything. And when they don't say anything to me, it means something, that everything went smoothly.
Right. Yeah.
There was no hiccups. There was nothing that stopped the camera from rolling. I mean, it's what I told Roger once. I said, one of the biggest jobs I have is make sure the camera rolls.
It's true.
As long as you want that camera roll, I want to do my part to make that successful.
That's a great way to sum up kind of the essence of our job is, what do we need to do to make the camera roll? I want to talk about one more thing with you. It seems like in a lot of these conversations, the conversation of a special location that's hard to find comes up, and the metaphor for it has become a tree. Kakai Ampa is talking about the tree in the Shawshank Redemption. Maida Morgan talked about how hard it was to find that tree in Fried Green Tomatoes. Do you have one? And I know you have a special relationship to trees. Talk a little bit about the locations that you're most proud of, and they were the special ones, the hard ones that you managed to pull off.
Well, there actually a couple, a few. But there was a tree, and I did, like, after I did Sicario with John Stark, he called me in the over Christmas, and he said, "Todd, I know it's not on your resume, but I want you to do Alvin and the Chipmunks with me in Atlanta."
I forgot you had done it. So you worked with Kyle Henshaw on that.
Yes, I love Kyle. That was great.
Kyle's a good man. I like Kyle. We started off.
He's a gem, and so I said, after a week, I sent him a text and I said, I don't know if I want to go to Atlanta. And he called me like a minute later and said, "Todd, it's not a question if you're going to Atlanta, it's when you're going to Atlanta. You're going on January 2nd. So I went there, and one of the scenes was a tree on a lonely road. And I talked to Kyle about it, and I think Kyle is the one that went out. And he found this tree, and I went out and saw it. It was just, perfect tree for that scene. Plus, it was a beautiful tree right by a farm. It's like a pain in the butt to make a deal with this farmer, but it all worked out. Then on the Hunger Games, the main tree that Jennifer Lawrence got up and was hiding in, we found and I was in a conservancy, 20,000 acre conservancy that had, various rules and regulations, although I put $60,000 worth of gravel down. They were happy about that. And, but I found this tree, and I took the director to it, and he was like, "Man, that's it." And that was the tree, that they put something around. And on that movie, there were so many amazing trees, man. I just, hugged them. I started when I was on Sicario. I took a picture of a tree and I put it up on Facebook, and I said, "Tree of the Day." And then after that, I had painted trees back I put them on plates, and I put them in paintings early on in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. There's a lot of trees in your art.
And I started doing that, but then I started doing this thing of painting trees into these paintings I was doing in the last couple of years. And it's just become this thing. I've read all these books on trees, and I did Cosmos: A Space-Time Odyssey. And Neil deGrasse Tyson talks in there about the DNA of a tree is like one molecule different than the human being, and there's this one, and I don't know if that's exactly the nomenclature for that, but there's this respect I have for trees because they are such a presence, but they breathe. And they talk about when you go into a forest, and then Hunger Games, I was in forest all the time, man. And there's this energy that you get just being in a forest that the trees give you, and so there's that relationship that I came to give a deeper respect for. And then my paintings that I do, the watercolors and paintings that I do that have trees in them are just fun, man. Because I can put a branch anywhere, and it's not wrong.
Right. Yeah. There's no rules when it comes to a tree branch.
There's no rules. Well, with art, there's no rules, and I never know what I'm going to paint till I paint it. I don't map out paintings. I just start them, and then somehow they get finished.
Thank you again for joining us at locationsonto.com for the podcast that takes you around the world and behind the scenes with location managers working in all facets of the entertainment industry. My name is Dodd Vickers, and you can find me online at doddvickers.com. Thanks again to the Location Managers Guild International for their support of the podcast. You can visit them online at locationmanagers.org. Until it's time to join me again on the back channel where the real work gets done on set, I'm switching back to one.